Now, on the 20th century, the bloody sieges of Khe Sanh and Thien. Miscalculation in Vietnam. Brimming with confidence, the United States, the most powerful nation on earth, expects to make short work of the hopelessly outgunned North Vietnamese in the mid-1960s. But those hopes quickly evaporate. Instead, the North Vietnamese turn out to be tough, smart, and resilient. And nowhere is that more evident than at the battles of Khe Sanh and Thien.
It was an experience that I'll remember till the day that I die.
Khe Sanh and Thien, two symbols of the futile war in Vietnam. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. For the U.S. Marines in Vietnam, charged with defending the tiny fire base known as Khe Sanh in early 1968, it was 77 days of hell. For days on end, the North Vietnamese rained down a constant barrage of artillery fire from the surrounding hills. U.S. firefights with tough North Vietnamese troops were short and sharp and deadly. Food ran low. There was the steady monsoon rain that left soldiers wet and miserable. And always, there was the fear.
I can remember just being in that foxhole with all your equipment around, everything prepared for the night, and shaking with fear and anticipation and terror, really.
The terror in that foxhole at Khe Sanh went on and on. In fact, there were two fights for Khe Sanh, one in the spring of 1967, the other, the big one, in early 1968. The U.S. had decided to make a stand there to try to reduce North Vietnamese infiltration across the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam.
Behind me, the DMZ, and behind that, the border with North Vietnam. We're with H Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, less than 500 yards from the demilitarized zone. North Vietnamese infiltration through the DMZ has been increasing in the past month. According to one intelligence source, the entire North Vietnamese 3rd Division has penetrated Vietnam's northernmost Quang Tri province.
Regular troops have been, in recent months, moving down from North Vietnam to South Vietnam in great numbers.
Westmoreland and the U.S. military command in Vietnam adopted a plan to defend the demilitarized zone by means of a series of strong points and a cleared path, what they call the trace, cleared path to the sea that they would be able to easily monitor anyone who tried to cross it.
One of those strong points was just outside the town of Khe Sanh. As early as 1966, General William Westmoreland tried to discourage North Vietnamese infiltration with an American show of force in the Khe Sanh region.
Operation Virginia begins quietly. No enemy resistance as the Marines drop into the landing zone. These men have a specially important mission: to secure the area around the Special Forces camp at Khe Sanh, the Army's most important outpost in this part of the country.
2, 3, 4, 5. There are 57,000 Marines in Vietnam, and their area of responsibility grows every day as the push northward increases in intensity. These troops are within easy striking distance of the DMZ and North Vietnam.
An airstrike was called.
In the spring of 1967, U.S. reconnaissance patrols from Khe Sanh began running into North Vietnamese troops. Through captured enemy documents, the Marines learned they were skirmishing with the advance elements of a force of at least 5,000 enemy troops. U.S. reinforcements were rushed in.
They moved over a battalion of forces into the Khe Sanh area and then actually established what they called a combat base.
Because the Khe Sanh combat base was surrounded by hills, Marines moved immediately to take control of the high points. But the North Vietnamese also knew how important those hills were.
I want you to jump off in the attack at 12:30 and take that objective, over.
As the enemy moved south, the Marines moved up to meet them. The two forces, numbering in the thousands, clashed heavily at Hill 881. and hundreds were killed on both sides in the largest battle of the war.
We were hit pretty badly. We received 8 to 10 mortar rounds in our position. They were at our positions within 5 to 6 meters before we knew they were there. I lost 5 of my best men in that one battle.
One come up and started throwing their Tricon grenades at us. Then right after we got him down, we knocked him down, we had 2 with a bonsai attack. They come up, Marine, you died today and all this.
Khe Sanh, the door into South Vietnam, has never been considered a tenable position. A year ago, it was a toss-up between reinforcing Khe Sanh and abandoning it. This year, there is no question of letting it go.
For days, American jets and long-range artillery pounded the hills until eventually the North Vietnamese withdrew, leaving hundreds of their dead behind.
That is the last objective of Hill 881 North, the northern knoll. Those Marines are arriving to secure it, ending a 12-day murderous battle by the Marines in northern South Vietnam to take these 3 deadly hills just outside of Khe Sanh.
155 Marines were killed in what came to be known as the Hill Fights, the worst American losses of the war so far.
I believe this is the worst though I've ever seen. It was like a 12-day nightmare.
The roughest part about the whole thing is hearing your buddy get it back in the rear when you're up front, or seeing somebody drop right on the side of you. That's the hardest part right there.
What do you do?
Well, there's nothing you can do. You call for a corpsman up to take care of him. Most of the time, the corpsman get it first. So you just wrap him up the best you can and drag him over in a hole and keep going.
It's miserable. You couldn't ask for worse. I won't wish it on the devil.
How do you feel about being here?
I don't like it. I don't like it at all. I lost a lot of good friends back there.
Despite the losses, the generals in Saigon and Washington believed Khe Sanh had to be defended no matter the cost. They did not want a repetition of what happened to the French 14 years earlier.
In all the television and newspaper reporting of the time, and in many people's minds, including the minds of military commanders at the time of Khe Sanh, Dien Bien Phu was the most used example of an analogy to what they were doing.
In 1954, the Vietnamese had shocked the world by overpowering 13,000 French defenders at a similar base called Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. For President Lyndon Johnson in particular, there was an eerie similarity between Khe Sanh and Dien Bien Phu.
The French are surprised, psychologically and physically stunned. Within hours, the Viet Minh captures the first of 8 strong points.
Dien Bien Phu was the last battle of the war that the French fought against the Vietnamese. In the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the terrain was very similar to what there was at Khe Sanh. That is, was a series of high hills surrounding a valley in which the French, in that case, had their forces.
That is why Westmoreland wanted the Marines to take control of the hills surrounding Khe Sanh. After succeeding in that, he then moved to beef up the main base by rebuilding the airstrip and establishing a permanent Marine garrison there. But there was another reason, too. He thought it was easier to fight the war along the border dividing North and South Vietnam.
It kept the war out of the South Vietnamese coastal lowlands, and because it enabled him to use his firepower and his reserves in the most productive manner, as he saw it.
But the North Vietnamese were not about to shrink from confronting the Americans at the border. Instead of focusing on Khe Sanh, though, they shifted their attention northeast to Thien, another American strongpoint along the demilitarized zone. And long-range North Vietnamese artillery was about to turn that U.S. firebase into a hell on earth for the Marines trapped there. The siege of Thien when the 20th century continues. Because Thien was so much closer to the DMZ than Khe Sanh, the North Vietnamese were able to use their heavy artillery, cleverly concealed in caves, to administer a wicked pounding to the forlorn Marines defending the base. And because the enemy guns were so well hidden, airstrikes and long-range artillery were almost useless in taking out those guns. As a result, the Marines at Khe Sanh had little between themselves and death but hope.
I can't say that I'm scared stiff, but I'm scared. I mean, after a while, you know it's going to come. And you can't do nothing about it. And you just look to God. It's about the only thing you can do.
Khe Sanh is here, 2 miles south of the demilitarized zone at the narrow top of South Vietnam, 12 miles inland from the South China Sea. It is a desolate hilltop collection of guns and bunkers looking north across the DMZ into North Vietnam. Its crucial importance lies in the fact that it's on a main infiltration route into the south. The loss of Khe Sanh could help open the way for the estimated 35,000 communist troops now massed in the DMZ area. On May 8, 1967, the North Vietnamese attacked the base in a battle that lasted till dawn.
That is what is left of a mass attack that hit Khe Sanh at around 4 o'clock this morning.
And they hit us with mortars, 82s, and I don't know what else, about everything you can think of. And then they started coming through our wire and trying to roll up our flanks from the right flank down there. And we tore them apart, that's about it.
The hilltop was strewn with dead, 200 of them, like this one. North Vietnamese regulars.
They place lesser premium on life than we do. They bring their people right in under their own mortars. And I'm sure they lost a lot of their own people to their own mortars.
The enemy had struck with a force of 1,200 men. Captured enemy weapons were gathered from all over the perimeter. The cost to the Americans in that first battle at Khe Sanh included 124 wounded. Of these, 110 were Marines, the rest Special Forces men. And there were our own dead, 44 Americans altogether, all of them Marines. The first to fall at Khe Sanh.
It ties into the Khe Sanh attack we had the other day, which they're trying to get some kind of a victory here in this northern part of I Corps right now. And they're expending a lot of men trying to do it.
Marine units are still locating enemy bodies 24 hours after the heaviest fighting has ended. Some of the dead were grotesquely sprawled near the barbed wire they breached under cover of a heavy mortar barrage. While the fighting subsided, neither side has been willing to stop the shooting entirely. Sniper fire was sporadic. The Marines responded with mortars and artillery.
During the next few months, the Marines dug in, preparing for another assault. And finally, in September, the North Vietnamese attacked again, this time with a vengeance.
They were really tough. They got right up to us. They didn't stop. We had our guns on them. We had grenades on them. We had mortars on them. We had air on them.
The battalion was firing back. We had fantastic fields of fire as they were coming across. And those little guys just kept on coming until we killed them all. And we killed them all.
Khe Sanh had to fight back against ground assaults and a sudden calculated escalation of enemy artillery, the most intense artillery barrage of the war.
The Khe Sanh battle was the first time the North Vietnamese forces in the Vietnam War used heavy artillery guns against American positions.
Emergency medevac, ASAP.
American casualties mounted. Nonetheless, General Westmoreland claimed the attacks were launched as a propaganda ploy.
Their objective is political and psychological. It is designed to weaken the will of the American people, to make it appear that they are stronger than they are in fact, and to discourage our resolve.
And that resolve, at least in the United States, was becoming more of a question mark. There were growing anti-war protests, and for the first time, polls showed half the country disapproved of the way President Johnson was doing his job. Part of that disapproval may have been the result of the rising casualties at Khe Sanh.
There isn't really much you can do, you know what I mean? You see the rounds come in, you see your buddies get blown away and wounded and stuff like that.
The enemy artillery, about 100 big guns plus mortars and rockets, can pound Khe Sanh around the clock with devastating effect. And our ground troops cannot go into North Vietnam to knock out those guns.
We can't reach those big guns, and they just keep dropping in. There's nothing you can do. It's just like being a big bullseye on top of a hill, and you're just sitting there waiting. You can't be safe. You can be lucky. That's it.
You get just as scared every time, and it gets worse. The closer they get, the more they throw. The more you get scared. Then you get up. It's a wonderful feeling just to be alive, to be able to walk around after one of those.
The only present alternative for the Marines is to sit out the shelling, take the casualties, and hope that American air and artillery strikes are hurting the enemy more. There is no way to tell. It seems clear that the American military offensive along the DMZ has bogged down, like the Marines in the mud at Khe Sanh.
It was a frustrating, deadly experience for those Marines trained to be a rapid offensive force. At Khe Sanh, they were stuck in one place.
I think we're just occupying ground and losing too many men. I'm losing too many men. If we were to stay here too much longer, we wouldn't have much left of this platoon, let alone the company. I see, what, about 3-4 people get it a day.
To try to stop the carnage, Americans were lobbing as many as 10,000 shells a day into the DMZ.
And then there are the B-52 bombers striking from nearby Thailand.
The Khe Sanh battle was kind of the blueprint for how you would use massive air power and artillery support to defeat a major enemy attack.
They pound the zone day in, day out with tons of explosives. With this saturation, why haven't the North Vietnamese positions been destroyed? Marine commanders say the enemy guns, most of them highly mobile, roll in and out of deep caves and tunnels. Only a direct hit can silence them. And there has been no silence at Khe Sanh.
In the cacophony of Khe Sanh, some analysts began to believe that the North Vietnamese were just trying to kill or wound as many Americans as possible. And if that was their plan, it was plainly working. The Marines at Khe Sanh were bleeding.
What happened to your squad?
Most of them was hit by shrapnel, and there was medevac.
Well, tell me, you came here at full strength?
Oh, I had 13 men when I came.
And it's 4 days later now, and how many are still here?
6.
Yeah. What was that, Major?
That was,
incoming or outgoing?
No, that was incoming. There was probably, it might have been a 120 mortar, or we have been receiving some 160 mortars here. Pretty big gear.
Well, what do? You sit here, you seem to be sitting ducks for all they throw in. Is it it must be an uncomfortable position for a Marine.
Well, it is. We don't have too much flexibility as far as moving out of here. However, we're digging in, and we're digging down, and we're taking it. And our mission is to defend this terrain. And the only way we can defend it is to dig down and get a good weapons emplacements and put plenty of barbed wire out and hold the ground.
For the troops inside the perimeter, this is the only kind of fighting they do, firing at distant targets, hoping to hit those rocket and artillery emplacements, firing back at them. Ammunition comes in first. Food and water have a lower priority. No one at Khe Sanh lacks food yet, but water has become a precious commodity. It's more valued than liquor. It's harder to get.
You see him?
Yes, sir.
You see where that smoke is?
Sure.
The daily hazard at Khe Sanh is the shelling. And when the cry, incoming, is heard, you don't wait. You jump for the nearest trench. In Khe Sanh, this happens all the time. And this is when men die. There's one thing certain about Khe Sanh that makes it different from any other place in the world. When you look at the Marines at this outpost, you know that before nightfall, some of the men you're looking at will be dead, and some will be wounded.
There seems little doubt that it is the administration's resolve to stay at Khe Sanh. Lyndon Johnson understands that a defeat or even a withdrawal now at Khe Sanh could be for him a political Dien Bien Phu.
This may not be a second Dien Bien Phu, but it's a strange and costly part of the Vietnam War. There's been nothing like it. And what is being accomplished here is far from clear. Marines sitting on a forlorn hillside and dying every day.
For me, it's hell. I mean,
you're always muddy. I have a great impulse to be clean all the time. You just can't be up here. You're muddy and wet all the time.
There was no way to wash, no good place to sleep, and no way to avoid the pain of the infantryman's plague, trench foot.
Some Marines have been in Khe Sanh and have been living this way for over 3 months. It never gets better, it only gets worse.
When you don't get a chance to do anything, you're always in your hole.
Always in your hole?
Always in your hole, I mean always. I'd say 22 hours a day I'm in my hole. They call me the mole.
Try to sleep during the day and you keep awake at night. And dodge incoming during the day.
You can't fight anything you can't, see, because the rounds come in so fast. By the time you start ducking down, they either give you a shower full of mortars or rockets.
But when you're getting arty rounds and rocketed, there's no way at all you can fight back. You just got to crouch in a hole and pray to God that you don't get hit.
Which arm, Brad?
Most of the wounded here are victims of shell fire. The bunkers in Khe Sanh are not deep enough. The trenches in the muddy ground are too shallow. They don't protect everybody when the heavy barrages come in. Simply surviving day after day is no easy matter on this hillside. On this day, 43 wounded Marines were brought out of Khe Sanh. Some of them had to lie on stretchers for over 2 hours before the helicopters could come in to get them and take them out. They had to wait through one 10-minute barrage of over 100 shells. The only thing that the Marines think about in Khe Sanh is when they'll get relieved and how to survive until tomorrow. This is the way it is, this is the way it's been, and this is the way it's going to be for quite a while at Khe Sanh.
For the beleaguered Marines, relief finally did arrive at the end of September in 1967 when enemy shelling just tapered off. Maybe it stopped because of the intense American bombardment. In 800 B-52 flights, nearly 22,000 tons of bombs had been dropped. Or perhaps the North Vietnamese had another target in mind. Whatever the reason, the Battle of Khe Sanh, like so much of what happened in Vietnam, ended in just another grinding, bloody stalemate. But Khe Sanh was, in effect, little more than a dress rehearsal for the hell that would follow at Khe Sanh, the siege of Khe Sanh, when the 20th century returns. As the bombardment of Khe Sanh petered out in late 1967, American intelligence detected a huge buildup of North Vietnamese forces in the Khe Sanh area. 4 infantry divisions together with 2 artillery regiments and armored units, a total of 40,000 men. No one knew for sure what were the enemy's intentions, but General William Westmoreland suspected the war might be moving to a more decisive phase, a phase in which he would have the chance to inflict significant losses on the North Vietnamese. So he sent 6,000 Marines into the Khe Sanh region.
I arrived in Khe Sanh on the 12th of December in '67. Our company was part of 4 or 5 companies that were airlifted into Khe Sanh. And we settled in on the western end of the runway. We dug in, and there was no fighting going on at the time.
Shortly after Christmas, Dennis Mannion's company was sent to defend Hill 861, just outside the perimeter of Khe Sanh. Almost 30 years later, Mannion's memories of those terrible days remain vivid.
That hill was not very large. It only had about 165 men on it. And we lived in the ground. Our bunker, when we finished, was almost 17 feet deep, and all the dirt was carried out in one little helmet and dumped outside.
Mannion's men would need all the protection they could get. Shortly after they arrived, the North Vietnamese attacked.
Our company commander sent my radio man and I down to the bottom of the hill. And just as we arrived at the bottom, the full-scale attack started on the other end of the hill. And by the time my radio man and I worked our way back up to the top of the hill, the CP bunker, the captain was badly wounded. The gunnery sergeant, who was a good friend of mine, was killed.
The North Vietnamese had penetrated Marine defenses on Hill 861, capturing the helicopter landing zone.
They started by firing between 150 and 200 mortar rounds into the camp. Then they launched a heavy attack with several hundred enemy firing rifles and grenade launchers. Some of the attackers were North Vietnamese regulars. They died on the barbed wire of the outer perimeter.
While Mannion and his company were fighting desperately to hold Hill 861, enemy artillery opened up on the main Khe Sanh base.
Just as the sun was starting to come up, about 5 o'clock in the morning, we started hearing the guns at the base responding to their own need because they were being attacked.
Then the ammunition dump was hit, sending smoke and flames skyward. An enemy mortar shell dug this crater at the Marine command post, disrupting communications and causing some casualties. How were you injured?
Well, it was pretty easy. They hit the ammo dump, and we were in the gun pit right next to it.
Despite the shelling, Marines carried their wounded buddies out of the huts to the airstrip, where the medevac helicopters would be coming to pick them up. There was no shortage of casualties on the Marine side.
The ferocity of the enemy attack so startled President Johnson that he began to wonder if the base could be held. To bolster the defenders, he authorized a huge escalation of airstrikes against the North Vietnamese attacking the base. B-52s, each carrying 54,000 pounds of explosives, hammered enemy targets every 3 hours. But that did not discourage the North Vietnamese from constantly probing the base defenses. So the U.S. airlifted in more troops.
I got there about the middle of January.
Jim Leslie, a 24-year-old Marine lieutenant just barely out of college, remembered his arrival at Khe Sanh. It took 3 heart-stopping attempts under heavy enemy mortar fire before his helicopter could safely land on the airstrip there.
I got off the runway as fast as I could and got in the closest ditch, and I jumped in there with my sea bag, and there was just a couple old dirty Marines laying in there, young kids actually, but they were 18, 19 years old, but looked like they were 45, 50 years old. They'd just been real seasoned by the war.
It was Leslie's first taste of war.
After seeing a lot of Marines getting hit and getting wounded and getting killed, I thought my chances of going back home were at this point pretty slim. So I kind of resigned myself to the fact that perhaps I wasn't going to make it. And at that point, I probably found the greatest peace that I had known before then or since.
From the North Vietnamese point of view, Khe Sanh is an easy target for its mortars and rockets, a convenient place to bleed the Marines, and what may be most crucial, tie down and isolate 6,000 American troops and another 20,000 reserves far from the unprotected coastal plains.
The pressure at Khe Sanh has lasted a week now, a bad week for the Marines here, a week in which they've suffered under the guns of the North Vietnamese in these surrounding hills.
Under constant barrage, the Marines dug in, waiting for the attack the generals believed would be the most significant battle of the war to date.
On the 31st of January, 10 days after the siege started, I wrote a letter to my high school buddy, best friend, and it was a farewell letter because I thought I was going to die there. And I also wrote a letter to my parents because I was convinced I was going to die.
But unknown to Dennis Mannion and the rest of the Marines at Khe Sanh that day, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had launched a surprise offensive throughout South Vietnam. It came on the Lunar New Year holiday known as Tet. Thousands of enemy troops stormed more than 100 South Vietnamese cities. As the battles raged throughout the rest of the country, the guns at Khe Sanh fell silent. But General Westmoreland thought the Tet attacks were a trick to lure the Marines out of Khe Sanh.
In my opinion, this is diversionary to his main effort, which he had planned to take place in Quang Tri province. From Laos toward Khe Sanh and across the demilitarized zone. This attack has not yet materialized. His schedule has probably been thrown off balance because of our very effective airstrikes.
President Johnson, too, thought that Tet was just a sideshow.
We may, at this very moment, be on the eve, very close to, a major enemy offensive in the area of Khe Sanh and generally around the demilitarized zone. I've been in very close touch with General Westmoreland to make absolutely sure that every single thing that General Westmoreland believed that was essential at this time was made available to him.
I think that President Johnson was supportive of his theater commander in South Vietnam, and up to a point he was willing to go along with whatever Westmoreland chose to do.
As it became clearer that in fact Tet was the main show, President Johnson's confidence in Westmoreland waned. He felt Westmoreland had badly misjudged enemy intentions. Nonetheless, Johnson shared Westmoreland's concern with the fate of Khe Sanh. What President Johnson wanted to avoid at all costs was another Dien Bien Phu.
If there had been a major defeat of this proportion coming on the heels of the Tet Offensive in particular, the political problem that arose when the Tet Offensive occurred would have been multiplied many-fold. I think this may be the basis for Westmoreland's fear that the North Vietnamese plan was to attack Khe Sanh in addition to attacking across South Vietnam.
The attack that's to come, the crunch the Marines call it, is expected later this week. And as far as Khe Sanh is concerned, the sooner the better.
When we come back, the story of what happened at Khe Sanh, and even more to the point, what did not happen there. The Tet Offensive was a spectacular propaganda victory for the North Vietnamese. Until then, no one had believed the communists were capable of launching an attack of such magnitude. It was a shocking political defeat for President Johnson, and it dramatically escalated his concern over the fate of Khe Sanh. What, he wondered, were the North Vietnamese up to?
He has massed perhaps 40,000 men along here and is expected to kick off at any moment a wide-scale offensive believed intended to overrun Vietnam's two most northernmost provinces and perhaps thus to bring the Saigon government in defeat to the conference table. He may move against any of those positions, but perhaps the most dramatic and significant battle may develop at Khe Sanh.
Johnson's concern about what might happen was so great that he asked for a memorandum signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying that Khe Sanh could be successfully defended. Publicly, though, Johnson was upbeat as he shook hands with a brigade of the 32nd Airborne Division leaving for Vietnam.
This is a decisive time in Vietnam. The eyes of the nation and the eyes of the entire world, the eyes of all of history itself, are on that little brave band of defenders who hold the pass at Khe Sanh and the area that is around it. We do not doubt the outcome.
And neither did the brave Marines defending Khe Sanh.
If they want to take this base, they're going to have to kill everybody in it, because we're not going to give it up.
The North Vietnamese appeared ready to test that resolve as they resumed heavy shelling at Khe Sanh. The enemy hammered the base from all sides, day in, day out, around the clock.
Khe Sanh is under continual siege. Some days it is worse than ever. That is when U.S. air power is unable to fly and bomb enemy positions because of poor weather.
Casualties mounted as the Marines waited and waited.
But waiting for it is nerve-wracking, and everyone wonders whether the next enemy shell is meant for him. They wait for that familiar warning, incoming. The reaction is universal.
Conditions for the troops there were abysmal.
You're living in a bunker now. Where were you a week ago?
Well, I was right over there in that tent. We had sandbags around, a little floor in it. It's pretty comfortable, but they leveled that for us.
Everyone had a bunker. This was about a 12 by 12 foot hole dug in the ground. We did have a lot of rain. Of course, the bunkers leaked water, and no matter where you put your gear, you pretty much got soaked.
Supplies of food and water soon ran short.
I would say before the siege, we received milk, fresh fruit, and things like that. Once the siege started, we were 1 C ration meal every day, 1 canteen of water every day. That was the limits.
The only way to get supplies or to get people in and out was either by helicopter or by C-130.
Getting in and out of Khe Sanh is even more dangerous than just being there, and the metal airstrip at Khe Sanh shows why. The runway is now littered with the wreckage of airplanes and helicopters.
It takes 40 minutes to fly from Da Nang to Khe Sanh in a C-123. 40 minutes of tension, stomach-turning anxiety, wondering if this plane with its load of artillery shells is going to make it, or whether it's fated to join the graveyard of twisted wrecks along Khe Sanh's runway.
Glide path. Below glide path, center line straight ahead.
The plane makes it to the unloading apron, the cargo is dumped, and passengers run frantically for the nearest hole and make it. But it's not always so easy. Minutes before, enemy fire took its toll of another C-123 loaded with troop replacements. It crashed about 5 miles east of Khe Sanh with 44 persons aboard.
As the days wore on, there seemed to be signs that the long-expected attack might finally be coming.
This is the first line of defense at Khe Sanh. 7 strands of barbed wire forming the outer perimeter. But now the North Vietnamese have gotten so bold that one soldier has actually penetrated all 7 strands and the minefields and actually entered the Marine base at Khe Sanh. He didn't get very far, gunned down just a few feet inside the perimeter. At nights, the North Vietnamese have been busy in other ways, too. Right over there, shaped like a letter L, is a North Vietnamese trench. Each night, they were digging a little more until it now comes within perhaps 150 yards of the Marines' own perimeter trench. One communist soldier has gotten through. What the Marines are waiting for is for 10 or 20,000 of them to try.
But still, no attack. American B-52s kept up their constant bombing runs against enemy positions, even as North Vietnamese artillery continued to pound Khe Sanh.
The North Vietnamese are not particularly good in their aim, but they know the area well now. They have an advantage of being able to look down on Khe Sanh from the surrounding mountains, and they put such a volume of fire into the valley that inevitably they hit something.
A lot of times it was either extreme chaos and excitement and nervousness to boredom. Probably 80 or 90% of the time it was complete boredom. And I would read books. Sometimes I read as many as 2 or 3 paperbacks per day, and everybody traded books. And almost every evening the Vietnamese would start dropping artillery rounds on us. And I thought, wow, I'm not sure if I'm going to make it through or not.
I know I'll make it.
How do you know?
That's what I believe.
You keep telling yourself that?
I keep telling, I pray at night.
By now, the Marines are used to the shelling. They can talk about it calmly, even as they hear the sound of a mortar going overhead. But they also know when to run for cover. Eating dirt is almost as normal as eating sea rations at Khe Sanh these days.
Living conditions continued to deteriorate.
I showered right after Thanksgiving in '67, and I didn't take another shower until the end of April in 1968.
But the lack of showers was the least of the Marines' problems.
Often I would go to sleep at night with the candle burning and watching the mice and the rats run around in the parachute net above me.
You'd be asleep at night and curled up on the floor, and the rats would run right over the top of you when they were moving through the bunker areas. It's a grim kind of thing, but after the siege started, there were so many North Vietnamese dead in and outside the barbed wire on 861 that the rats on 861 were not a particular problem.
After I gave up the thought of really going back home alive, then the war became almost tolerable, became a challenge. And I'd volunteer to do missions just for the excitement of it.
I was wounded twice on 861. I was in a bunker that a North Vietnamese soldier fell into, and we were being overrun, and a grenade went off and killed a couple Marines who were in the bunker. And I had a small piece of shrapnel go through my cheek, and part of somebody's ribs went into my little finger, just above my little finger in my hand. The corpsman dug it out the next day. And then 2 months later, I was wounded when a mortar shell landed behind me and above me, and pieces went through my arm and my flak jacket. But I was lucky. There's no talent there. That's just luck. I went from 20 to 21 on the hill, and it seemed like a terrible place to spend a 21st birthday. And I guess my thoughts mostly were that I was hoping I'd make it to be 22.
The North Vietnamese never did launch an all-out attack on the base. They had suffered stunning casualties, as many as 10,000 men from the unprecedented U.S. bombing. By late March, the North Vietnamese dramatically reduced shelling of the base, and as with the Thien siege, they finally began to withdraw. But in a sense, they got what they wanted, a policy change in Washington.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
When he said, I won't accept, or I won't seek or accept another term as your president, I really thought and looked at these guys and said, why are we here then? What are we doing here? I mean, if the man in charge is giving up and getting out, the commander-in-chief is giving it up, what are we doing here in this little bunker?
As it turned out, they wouldn't be in those bunkers much longer. After 77 days, the air cavalry officially relieved Khe Sanh.
It didn't surprise me that we were leaving Khe Sanh. At that time, I thought it was a wise decision to get out of there. I felt it was a situation where we were never going to be able to win.
There wasn't a Marine who survived Khe Sanh who wasn't scarred by the harrowing siege. So many gave so much for so little.
I guess one of the worst times I could recall would be the time Captain Ken Pipes was taking his unit right in front of our lines. There was two platoons that were supposed to do a little sweep about 50 yards to 100 yards outside of our barbed wire. I was able to see them quite plainly as the fog blew up. And what happened is the ground fog was so dense where they were at some parts, they walked over top of the Vietnamese who were dug down in spider holes, maybe 2 foot in diameter. As Ken Pipe's company walked past, the Vietnamese came up out of their spider holes and just started machine gunning these Marines down, who were then being shot from the back and from the front. It was such and it all took place in a period of 3 to 5 minutes, but it felt like 3 hours. And I was listening to them on the radio, and I was watching it happen, and there was nothing I could do. The area between our perimeter and where Ken Pipe's men were was heavily mined. So there was just no way that I could help them. They were stuck there. And finally, a couple Marines made it through our minefield, and at least I knew where there was a path, and so I was able to go out there and help them. But they were just so wounded. They were just so wounded. But that was my worst day. My worst day.
I think everybody that was there, in a sense, lost part of their souls. I don't know who won militarily. In a sense, it was probably a stalemate. They took more casualties than we did, but I didn't care about their casualties. I just knew that friends of mine died there.
According to the Pentagon, 205 Marines were killed during the siege of Khe Sanh. But the base chaplain there said that he personally counted 441 body bags. And the official count did not include the South Vietnamese soldiers who fought alongside the Marines, nor the estimated 5,000 local Montagnard tribesmen who were killed, nor the Air Force pilots shot down on bombing runs, nor the 130 Americans killed in the fight to relieve Khe Sanh. Despite those sacrifices, the U.S. military commanders decided that the significance of Khe Sanh was, after all, too small to maintain an American garrison there. Some final thoughts when the 20th century returns. The sieges at Khe Sanh and Thien were a result of a huge and costly miscalculation. The U.S. command was so determined to avoid a military defeat similar to the one that brought the French to their knees at Dien Bien Phu that many believe the North Vietnamese figured out how to make that apprehension work to their advantage. When the Tet Offensive was launched at the end of January in 1968, General Westmoreland thought it might be a diversion, a feint, designed to distract attention from the big battle to come up toward the DMZ. But the evidence strongly suggests otherwise. The shelling of Khe Sanh served to draw U.S. manpower away from South Vietnam cities and towns, leaving these cities open to attack. Even when the Tet Offensive was underway, General Westmoreland remained slow to grasp the full significance of those orchestrated attacks. It would not be the first time, nor the last, that the United States miscalculated North Vietnam's intentions. In retrospect, Khe Sanh and Thien are two more metaphors for the overall futility that defined the American experience in Vietnam. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century.